Hello, everyone. We are back with our monthly roundtable with our favorites. My co-host, John Pasalis with Realosophy Realty, is here with me in Toronto. Hi, John.
Hello. Looking
And
forward.
Steve, with Oakwin Realty out in Vancouver. Steve Saretsky. Nice.
Yeah, good to be back. I'm not dressed up today, but John looks dapper enough for the both of us. So
I'm a little bit dressed up. I'm in between, but
Mhm.
no,
there's a
you're looking
range.
good. I, I'm
There's
the
a
I'm the
range.
I'm the schmuck here, but no, I'm
You
looking
know what?
forward to this.
I think together you're channeling how we're all feeling, just all over the
Conflicted
place.
all over the
Jeez.
place.
Yeah, that's
Extremely
right.
conflicted. It seems like we're being yanked around emotionally everywhere, so why not, you know?
Oh,
100%.
Um,
100%.
yeah. Okay, so let's start with the usual check-ins. I know we have other news to discuss this month, but Steve, let's start with you out in Vancouver. There was some thinking at the start of the year that maybe things were starting to pick up. What are the latest numbers in the Vancouver market suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's you know the narrative for sure was, oh, this is going to be like a good year. I think coming to the back half of 2024, like especially in October, November, December, like it was actually like a pretty active market. Like we saw that momentum coming through. The real estate industry isn't real estate. It is, is an industry that's built on hope and optimism. And so I think the narrative was like, oh, this is going to be a good year. Rates have been coming down. And I was kind of a little bit skeptical of that. I'm always a little bit skeptical in general, but I think what we're seeing now is some of that momentum starting to fade. Obviously, with the tariff wars, that's creating a lot of uncertainty. I think we'll get into it later in this conversation, I'm sure, but I think there's still a lot of people that, particularly in the condo market where you have a lot of these investors that wanted to sell last year, maybe tried to sell last year, didn't get their price, didn't move. And there's something's got to be done with that inventory. And if you look at the data, if you unpack it, um, the number of listings in the condo market hit an all-time high for the month of January. So if you go back 20 plus years for Greater Vancouver condo listings, the number of new listings hitting the MLS system, um, it was an all-time high this January. So there's a lot of people that still want to get out, need to get out. And yeah, there's more buyers. Sales are up, but not enough to absorb the listings that are coming to market. And so we'll see how that shapes up over the next several months.
Sales are up for you guys year over year.
In the condo market, they were up slightly. So they were up 14% year over year. But now keep in mind, like last January was not a very strong January, right? So we're up 14% off a pretty weak base effect.
Mhm. Interesting.
John, what's the story in Toronto, specifically on the condos, something that we've been watching for a while now? You know, the prices have been holding, the listings have been climbing. When are things going to change? How long can the prices hold? Is there any sign in the Toronto market that the in again, huge amount of supply coming on?
Ton. Yeah, ton. And you know what's interesting that this month is that the data for houses and condos are actually quite similar. Sales for both were actually down 9 to 10% over last year. Last year was a pretty crap year, not as bad as 2023, but the first quarter of last year was relatively busy, maybe first 4 or 5 months. There were a little more competition, sales have picked up. So we're below last year, but the big difference is that the number of new listings, in particular active listings, is up more than 50% year over year. So ton more listings on the market. And of course, a lot of this was spillover from last year. A lot of properties are sitting on the market end of the year in December. That spilled over, but we did see a surge in new listings as well. And normally this time of year is relatively busy because there's usually a lot of demand, people jumping in the market, but not a lot of listings. And the opposite is happening, a ton of inventory. In terms of how it's shaping out, I mean, I think Steve's correct. I mean, that there's an overall sentiment that the market would be busier. I mean, I thought it'd be a little bit busier, but there was a lot of optimism, to be honest, which I did not buy into, like Steve. Like even a lot of clients we met with, I got to be honest, like the uptick that Steve talks about in the latter half of 2024, October, November, we saw it on the ground is a lot of times like buyers felt like they wanted to rush in ahead of what they thought was going to be a busy spring market, and even though we're like, listen, it might be busier, but we're not going to be like crazy bidding wars. Some buyers were anxious. They want to rush in. The real estate industry was pretty optimistic. The federal government obviously relaxing mortgage rules, increasing the limit on insured mortgages, but that hasn't moved the needle. The market in January is kind of like it was back in September, before we saw that slight uptick in demand. So super sluggish, very slow. And it's going to be interesting how it all plays out. And like Steve said, I mean, I think a lot of investors were waiting for a better market, renting their units or taking them off the market or expecting things to get better. And we were just chatting before the show. It's going to be interesting to see what 2025 looks like if it doesn't look like things are getting better. You know what I mean? Like, what do people do? I think for people who need to sell or really need to move on, they've been kind of holding tight, hoping to get those peak 2022 prices. And that's really what has kept people hanging on. Like prices have been pretty flat for the past while, but they don't like today's prices. They want 2022 prices, right? So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out in prices over the next 6+ months, if we see some pressure on prices.
All right. And is that a similar story, Steve, for homes in Vancouver, or still seeing that difference between the two markets?
Yeah, well, I was just gonna to add to John's point. I think like even when people like say, "Oh, I could have got this price in February of 2022 at the top of the market. I'm willing to take less." I think what we're seeing is just a lot more people that like, "Oh, well, I bought in 2021 or I bought in 2020, it wasn't the top of the market." But once you start adding on, well, I had to pay closing costs, transfer taxes. Now I got to pay a realtor fees. And then you start adding up sort of all the transaction costs. And they're like, well, today's price, like net of fees and taxes, like there's no profit. Like you are losing 20, 30, 50, $100,000. And so people go, whoa, so I think that's just like a tough reality for a lot of people, right? Everyone's just so used to the market moves up, whatever, 8 to 10% a year, and you can easily recoup, a 5% GST and a 2% transfer tax and a 3% realtor fee. So like, I think that's the big challenge that we're seeing today. And then in terms of like the market activity, I mean, I still think this year will be kind of the year of segmentation, which is to say that entry-level single-family houses, you look at number of new listings, still very low, below average, inventory still low. We're seeing multiple offers in pockets of that segment. And so that market is still relatively strong because you have a mix of these end user families that still really want their single family house. And they're almost colliding with these new multiplex builders that have sort of emerged thanks to the upzoning policies of the BC government and the municipal governments. And so those two sort of cohorts are competing. And so that segment I'm finding is still moving very, very quick. And then you've got the condo market, which is a totally different ball game. These little one beds or two beds that I think used to cater a lot to investors. That market's suffering. And I think what we'll get into is what's happening in the rental market.
I was actually wanting to ask you about that, Steve. I saw you were tweeting about maybe the one thing the federal CMHC and maybe the federal government should have taken credit for this before Justin resigned or left there, is the loans. The cheaper loans seeming to really work, that program getting out cheaper loans to purpose-built rentals, builders of purpose-built rentals. You noted a huge uptick, and that's probably the one measure that's working. But what does that mean then to the rental market? Good news for renters. Prices seem to be going down. But again, that's the renters that you're counting on if you're an investor,
Yeah.
of condos and things. So now you've got this product competing. And I understand, Steve, that some downward pressure on rents is already being seen in Vancouver.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you unpack that, it's basically so the federal government brought in the CMHC loan program for developers, basically allows them to get very cheap, favorable financing terms, which has allowed the pro formas to work for these rental apartment buildings. So they basically started building a lot of rental apartment buildings over the last 5, 6 years. A lot of those are now coming to completion at a time when you also got record completions in the pre-sale space, right? So think about all the pre-sale investors that bought these little dog crate condos. Those are completing. And so you've got this whole cohort of like, okay, there's fewer sort of mom and pop investors because the numbers don't work. But now you've got all these completing units, not only in the purpose-built rental space, but in the pre-construction space at a time when you also have pulled back on immigration as well. And so it's kind of like this perfect storm where you are just seeing this, more and more units available for rent. It's taking longer to rent, which is also putting downwards pressure on rent. So we're getting calls now from people that are saying, "Hey, we talked last year about maybe selling my condo. My tenant left. I tried to fill the vacancy. It's been now vacant for 3 months. It's very quiet. How long can I continue to hold a vacant unit? This is killing me, right? It's costing me every time it's vacant, it's costing me $3,500 a month." And so there's difficult decisions that now need to be made and say, okay, well, you're gonna have to reduce your rent. Do the numbers work at the reduced rent, or do you just immediately get this thing on the market and sell it? And so people are now having to make difficult decisions. And so I think another catalyst that is going to impact this condo market is declining rents that I don't think are going to turn around this year. And so people that maybe thought about selling last year, or you got a pre-sale construction condo that's closing this year and you penciled 2,800, but now you're only getting 2,600, your numbers look a lot worse. So yeah, we'll see. I don't know, John, what you're seeing over in the GTA, but I think
I
that's
I want to
core
even
theme.
say, John, a fancy purpose-built rentals come up right outside of your HQ,
Yeah.
Velocity HQ, right? I believe your team has been showing that. Again, similar trends in Toronto.
So we represented a builder who completed like a 40 unit purpose-built rental. They had a hard time renting them kind of off market, so we've been helping them. The volumes have been decent. But again, we it was slow until we reduced the price a little bit, then all of a sudden things were moving. And I think that's the thing with rentals. Um, it's highly sensitive to where you're at. If you're like $100 above market, no one even looks at it. They don't even care, and it's partly why the rental market is a little bit, it's less sticky on the way down. Like home prices are slow to drop. Rent prices, some landlords just want to move the product. Like Steve said, they don't want to be sitting on a vacant unit for 3 months. So they'd rather just cut the rent by $100 a month or 150 because at least you're still going to get 2,500, so they don't want to hold out for that extra $100. So 100% same dynamics here, like record condo completions over the
Hey,
past year or
John,
so. Yeah.
just to chime in there, sorry to interrupt you, but like the one thing that is important to like clarify here is like think about a mom and pop investor, right? That's kind of already a little bit tight on the margins. It's like they don't have the luxury of sitting on a vacant unit for like a couple months, right?
No,
If you're
yeah.
like an institutional type of investor that owns an entire rental building,
Yeah.
you've got a lot more sort of staying power where you can kind of weather out that storm, so to speak. You can be a little bit more firm on your rent prices.
Yeah.
It's the mom and pop
He's,
that starts to panic and says, I just got to get this thing filled.
Yeah, and you're 100% right. That's exactly what's happening. Like the landlord we're representing, they're a little bit more firm. We're slightly above market-ish, close depending on the product because they have a nice building and they're just sticking to their price. And people are renting them, you know what I mean? But they're not renting everything in the matter of like 30 days. It's taking a little bit longer. But you're right, the mom and pop landlord can't afford to just sit on vacant units. So rents in Toronto are down probably about 11% from the peak.
Mhm.
We were at, I don't know, just under 3,000, like 29 and change. Now we're like 26 and change or something like that. And again, a lot of this is just it's effectively a supply shock. You know what I mean? It's like the opposite of what we saw during COVID. During COVID, prices skyrocketed because you had a demand shock, right? a ton of people chasing fewer homes. Today we have fewer people chasing a surge in rental listings, right?
Yeah.
And I agree, and I think that's going to make it harder for certainly for investors over the months or years ahead that they're holding on to these things in a market where condo prices are not going up, rents are going down, condo prices may dip a little bit. So it's going to see interesting to see how obviously this plays out and what investors do over the next year.
So just to give a real like life example, and like this is a fairly common scenario. Like I'm not saying like our inbox is flooded with this, but like this is real. Like I've certainly had quite a few, several of these conversations. My colleagues have had several of these conversations. So we know what's happening. Um, is like let's just say you bought a pre-sale condo 3 years ago, maybe not quite at the peak, but now you're closing on it, and again, the time you pay transfer tax, GST, realtor fees, plus the market's dipped, you've got someone that's staring down net of fees and taxes. Let's call it they're going to lose $100,000. So they're saying, okay, it's closed now, I've got a vacant unit, I just closed on it, I can sell this thing and I can walk away. I'll lose $100,000, gone, evaporated, never to return again. Or I can choose to rent it out, live another day, but net of everything, I'll lose $1,000 a month. So like what basically it's like, do you have two shitty decisions to make? Which one do you want to go with? And so I think that we've seen quite a few people going, well, I'll go the $1,000 a month route. And so, these people close, let's say last year. Now their tenancy's coming up and they're like, okay, well, I've just lost $12,000. I call Steve for an updated valuation. Steve says the number is the exact same. So do I decide to take my $100,000 hit this year? Or do I go for another year and lose another 12 grand? So it's really just like at some point, it's like, how long are you willing to wait? I mean, some people can lose $1,000 a month for the next 10 years and they'll just deal with it. And some people say, you know what, I gotta pull the ripcord. And I think that at some point, and maybe it's this year, I suspect, at least what we're seeing in the new listing volume, that maybe more people are willing to pull the cord.
You mentioned, thanks, Steve. You mentioned supply shock. I think both of you. How much of this is a shock that will eventually be absorbed, and how much of this is an actual change in our rental market? Presumably after not seeing a lot of purpose-built rentals for a long time, there's been a return to seeing that again in Canadian cities. Does this mean that the market for renters is going to change? Because while the condo supply tends to moderate, as to whether your units are selling or not. The purpose-built rental market, as it starts to make inroads, presumably starts to take a share of renters out of that market permanently over time. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Like, is there, something that's fundamentally changing?
I mean, I think a little bit as we're building more purpose-built rentals. I mean, we see it, like I said in the listing we have. Some people just prefer a professionally managed apartment building. They don't want to deal with some, mom and pop landlord that they're never going to see. But in terms of the shift, I mean, I don't think that's going to be a massive like permanent shift. Like I think there's still space for condo rentals. I think the bigger challenge over the next 2 years is going to be we still have a lot of units in the pipeline, right? And we're going to still see quite a few completions in 2025 and 2026 in an environment potentially where population growth is zero or negative, right? So you have 200 plus thousand completions per year with no new demand in terms of population growth. What does that do to the market? Well, like logic is either prices dip a little bit or rents dip a little bit, one or the other, and possibly both, but very likely rents. So I think that's going to be the reality that's going to be interesting. And I think it's going to be challenging for our economy broadly because new construction sales are off a cliff. Governments are trying to change taxes, can push people to builders to convert their units to purpose-built rentals, which is all great in theory. But like, as a builder, are you building or launching new projects in an environment where rents are plummeting? Like there's obviously a tension there, right? Like you have to have some confidence in where things are going in the long term. So I think again,
You also have to get the financing for that, right? And I think CMHC, which has been doing a lot of the financing for that, from everyone that I chat with in that space is telling me that they're starting to clamp down, right? I mean, they're starting to double check developer for pro forma and saying, hold on, you're penciling in these rents? Maybe not. And
Interesting.
so I think that financing, John, is going to get tighter.
Yeah, 100%. And I've looked at that too. I've looked at some, people talking about building purpose-built rental, their projections for rents. I'm like, you're high at today's prices. Like, forget where rents might be a year from now or 2 years from now, right? And I think that's the challenge in Canada. It's like we have a ton of stuff in the pipeline that are small units, that are rentals geared towards the rental market, but with this massive shortage of family-sized housing. There's a massive disconnect. So, it'll be interesting to see kind of
Can I say something? I don't know. I mean, like this probably opens up the can of worms, but like
open it up.
it I mean, it feels to me like the supply and demand mechanism is working, right? I mean, we built a lot of supply, or we are building a lot of supply, which is putting downwards pressure finally on rents and prices. At the same time, we've targeted the demand side by reducing immigration.
Yeah.
So I mean, it feels like the market forces now, which is supply and demand, is taking root.
Yeah. I mean, okay. Yeah. Yes. Yes and
Here we
no.
go.
Listen, I think the challenge with supply and demand is that economists treat houses like they're widgets out of a factory. Okay.
Hmm.
And I think that's the challenge. When we think about demand, the demand for houses is not just about population growth. Okay. Because as you know, the second you relax credit, you push interest rates to zero. Well, the
100%.
demand skyrockets, not because there's so much more demand for people who want a home. The demand from everyone who wants to store their capital shoots through the roof, right?
100%.
And
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
think that's where this whole supply demand, we just, is a bit nuance. It's not
Yeah.
just how many people are coming into the country. Let's match that with the number of homes because it's a financial asset. It's completely different.
Yeah. Well, it's always like, yeah, I mean, that's the thing. You have to figure out what is pulling the levers on the demand side, right? I mean, you go back to 2015, 2016 when you had a flood of foreign capital coming into the market.
Exactly.
Obviously, majority of that coming from China. Like
Mhm.
you didn't matter how much you built in that short time frame. I mean, the demand was overwhelming. And of course, that was when our government told us we were all xenophobic, and it was a non-issue. And then we figured out that they're bringing in hockey bags of cash through the casinos and laundering it and pushing home prices up. So like, you know what I mean? So I agree with you. Like it's not always that simple, but I think that, you know, yeah, by lowering the cost of capital, by creating that sort of speculative frenzy, it actually sort of almost took care of itself, which is to say you had all these people that were frothing at the mouth to own a pre-sale. And by doing so, as the music stopped, we've now realized, oh, crap, maybe we did overbuild, at least in the short term.
Well, I mean, I don't think we overbuilt because I mean prices are still insanely high. You know what I mean? So in the idea is, I mean, you build so much, maybe you overbuild in the short term technically.
Yeah.
We're only overbuilding if population growth goes to zero, right? But the idea of that is prices eventually fall. But going back to the supply demand, it's not just that population growth will go to zero over the next year or so, but as we discussed, the demand from investors is plummeting again, partly because rates are high,
Yeah.
because you have other places to invest your capital, not just houses when rates are zero, but also investing in houses was more costly. So like the higher rates have this dual effect where there's better alternatives, plus the real estate option is actually more expensive now because I got to pay 5% on my mortgage rather than 3%, right? So the capital flowing into houses has declined as long as obviously rates stay where they are, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah. I mean, like rents obviously up, what, in Toronto, call it 40% over the last
Oh,
three,
and
4
yeah.
right? So now you get a 10% reduction. It's like, well, I mean, the rents are still unaffordable for most of society. So, I mean, yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Uh, and also, I would observe that, we became a nation of renters. It wasn't just the foreign capital, the mom and pop segment, Steve, that you're talking about. It was easier to hang on. Like if, you had a condo, you got married, hanging on and not always selling. We all started to change our behaviors after low rates for a long time, right?
Mhm.
We forget after 9/11, and then there was a 2008 shock, and then, COVID. It just seems like that was our reality, and now it's not. And so I wonder if that's part of the reason that we're seeing this. But my observation would also be on the supply side, Steve, that I feel that the supply side advocates kind of missed a bit of the focus on this one because it was that CMHC low financing mechanism that I think far more than all the unleashing of the zoning and the multiplexes and all that that's
Mhm.
made the big difference. And I'm very surprised that on the new construction side, even the home side, that builders wouldn't try to agitate for access to low cost financing.
Mhm.
I asked that, I believe, John, to it was the head of the builder group that we were speaking to on our show
Yeah.
um, a few weeks ago. The name is just slipping me, is slipping.
Matt Young.
Yes, Matt Young. Yes, from the Coalition of,
I
I
can't
forget
remember.
their acronym. It can't. I
Can't,
know the
that's right.
acronym is can't, but it was
Coalition against, I can't remember. Yes, anyways.
something, right? Housing, I don't know, it's somehow spelled can't, I think. And I asked Matt, why wouldn't you go after that mechanism? In the what they were leading the charge was for a reduction of development charges. And they were saying on their pro forma, like it's the development charges that make the bigger difference. But I still do wonder, where the one mechanism that could maybe not make us so susceptible to these strange booms and busts is the government using at least their financial power in that way to counteract when rates are going high and low because of the macroeconomic conditions.
Hmm. But I'm gonna open up a can of worms too, though. I mean,
Stir the pot.
I mean, we are advocates of free markets, but what we're talking about now, if we are
Yeah.
advocates of free markets, is massive government intervention to effectively insure loans to builders. Okay. And that is opposite of free markets. This is a very interventionist approach to housing. And I think the builders, the free market advocates are not against that because they benefit from the intervention. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Obviously, it's a good thing because it's stimulated more housing, but there are, of course, limits, right, to how much you want to intervene.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're both, you and I are both in agreement that, there is no such thing as a free market. I think that died a long, long time ago, particularly when it comes to Canadian housing. So,
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, sorry.
I'll leave
Any.
it to you.
I want to. I want to continue this fight before I get to another one.
Let's go. Let's move on.
All right. Have you settled your differences for now,
We're
boys?
yeah,
good.
yeah,
We're
we're in
good.
alignment.
So what is my setup for the next topic? Had a very unusual weekend up to go help my mom make sure she has enough salt for her driveway on Sunday, just about 40 minutes north of Toronto in a suburb, and stopped into the LCBO. This is Ontario's provincially controlled liquor store chain. And I saw this very confused employee about to put yellow hazard tape over some, Jack Daniels, Jim Beam. So obviously trying to start to figure out where the American products may have to come off the shelves. Then I see this family, rushing around just grabbing bottles of red wine from California. I glared at them to say, where's your patriotism? But I wonder if they were restaurateurs. There was something about it that made me think, they were just grabbing some wine inventory. So anyway, I'm talking, of course, about one of the biggest happenings in the Canada-US trade relations in a very long time. The announcement by Trump that 25% tariffs would be applied blanket across all Canadian imports. And then it actually did happen. I think that shocked us a bit because we thought, well, this is a bluster. Um, but then all of a sudden it went away within a day. What, what a roller coaster. Um, so I think everyone's still reeling. Steve, I want to go to you. I think you recently had the Alberta premier who stood out, Danielle Smith, for having a very non-unified approach to dealing with the I don't know what we call him. There's so many insults, but there's I don't know the great winner, I guess, because he's always winning, the winner to the south. And you recently spoke to her on the Looney Hour podcast, and so I'm wondering what you think about all of this out in Vancouver, and also maybe bring in that Calgary and that Alberta perspective as well.
Um, well, I mean, I think for her, I mean, obviously she's looking out for her constituents. I think that I think, whatever you think of her and the country and politics, it's like clearly Alberta is not well liked in Ottawa. I mean, they haven't been treated well. And so I think she's just like, well, I'm going to take this into my own hands. So it is what it is. I think that yeah, I don't know. We'll see what happens in 30 days from now. I think a lot of Canadians will argue about why we're getting tariffed, and I think we're having Sam Cooper on the podcast this week to talk about the fentanyl problem, and he believes, and he's written books about the magnitude of it. I think a lot of Canadians will be very, very surprised to know that we have a serious problem here, and so trying to figure out, again, I think people are saying, well, is he doing it because he wants Canada to legitimately become the 51st state and take us over economically and kill us? Or does he actually think we have a fentanyl problem? He's trying to stop that. So I don't know where we go from here. I think on the impacts of housing is kind of how I try to frame it up to that lens and just say, listen, this is creating a lot of uncertainty where one day you have 25% tariffs and you think you're going to lose your job. The next day they're off. Maybe they're back in 30 days. Like, how do you make a $2 million house purchase decision on that basis? I think it's creating a lot of uncertainty for just, even the average person trying to make decisions, but not only that, but investment decisions. And so I think that's where we start layering it on and saying, okay, like how do we navigate this housing market in 2025? And coming back full circle, like if I'm an investor and I normally buy pre-sale condos or rental condos, like what's the allure for me to jump into the pool right now? Right. And that's why I still think that segment of the market is really going to struggle this year again, because it's got to be compelling for me to jump in. And so you're saying, well, there might be 25% tariffs next month. That will cause a lot of job losses, particularly in Ontario, which means my rents are probably going lower, not higher. I better be getting a pretty darn good price on a condo if I'm going to throw a couple $100,000 down. I don't know. That's where I kind of look at it because I have no idea what's going to happen with tariffs.
John, in Toronto, I mean, so many industries are exposed
Yeah.
to that really one of the most integrated trade relationships in the world. So all kinds of jobs that you wouldn't think could be affected. I'm not sure if you can be affected. So I'm not sure if you're hearing from clients and consumers even worrying about their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with Steve 100% that this, all of these tariffs, all of these announcements, and obviously this is somewhat recent where he's been talking about this because the market was more optimistic in October, about the market rebounding, the housing market, the economy maybe doing a little bit better. And all of that obviously gets tossed in the trash the second you have this type of aggressive trade policy. That is quite frankly irrational. And I think this is the big difference from 8 years ago. 8 years ago, Trump also was pissed off about our trade agreement. So they negotiated it for like a year and ended up being like a nothing burger. Like no one really cared, right? Didn't really do anything. But now he's coming out swinging overly aggressively. And the interesting part is no one really freaking gets it. Like, yeah, okay, yeah, maybe we have a fentanyl issue. I mean, is there that much flowing across the border compared to the Mexico? I mean, I don't know. Like, it doesn't seem like that is the biggest issue. But again, that doesn't matter. The issue is that it's uncertain what the hell's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And even if it's kind of resolved in 30 days, you don't know what's going to happen next. And I wonder, like, is 2025 going to be like a more sluggish year for housing than even last year, which is pretty soft? Because again, like Steve said, like the only people who are buying are people who need to buy, right? Or want to buy or life changes or whatever. But a lot of this, if people are worried about their jobs and the economy, yeah, a lot of people are gonna move to the sidelines. But I don't know. I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts. I mean, Urmi doesn't like talking about herself, but she's the only one who actually studied trade and actually negotiated trade between Canada and the
All right, let's
US.
go.
Um,
Oh,
at finance. Like, what the hell is your take on this? Like, because I don't understand like what his end goal is. Like, it just
God.
seems so irrational compared to 8 years ago.
My gosh, don't give me the mic. I'm not sure our viewers are gonna like this. So, couple things I want to say here. One thing, Steve, and here I'm going to push back a little, which is very interesting about Canada and the US's trade agreement is this has always been cooperation of industry and a call for a free market, free trade, right? And often the opposers to this has not been the companies on the other side. Yes, protectionism is there, but another person, of course, is the governments of countries who have always used security concerns, national security, and other reasons to protect certain industries and certain markets. Now, Canada does this. We protect certain industries. We don't allow you in to just do your banking model the way you want, the way Trump was suggesting he wanted American banks to be allowed in. There are rules that govern certain sectors. So what's very interesting about free trade, and I worked on it like my first real job in government years ago was about 7, 8 years after 9/11, was at Finance Canada doing the US Canada trade relationship. And the complaint there from the Canadian and steel manufacturing industry was all the homeland security measures that were really, really messing up their trade. Because what we don't realize is free trade is so integrated, it is the stuff of a lawyer's dreams. People have made millions off of interpreting NAFTA and WTO rules of origin. A bar of steel, if it goes over once and it gets melted a certain way, it's transformed. If it goes to Mexico and only gets painted, it's not substantially transformed. Hundreds of rules govern, and that bar of steel just keeps moving around. Different things are happening to it, and eventually turns into the products that we all know today. So, this regime that was built up after World War II is so integrated, and it has always been a place for people to have disputes. If I say the word softwood lumber out in BC, right? Common dispute. The US always says we underprice our logging, our lumber. It's because it's logged on Canadian federal lands that don't charge as much as the private lands that the US logs off of. That's just an advantage we have. They claim we're undercutting the market, and year after year we go to the tribunals and fight it, right? So this is a world in which it's kind of bloodless. It's just like a lot of arguing, but over a lot of papers, and things like that. And for a long time, I think even when the fights got vicious, that's been the battle. Now, the after 9/11, we have to be careful because after 9/11, there was again this Homeland Security. I remember the second Homeland Security Secretary, I was an underling that got sent to this meeting in Washington, and I don't think my boss thought I was going to talk to Michael Chertoff directly. But we were in a small meeting, and he again said that the 9/11 attackers came from Canada. And it was maddening because we had spent the entire days saying what are our real problems and what are not. For example, Canada has a smuggling of cigarette issue over, certain parts of our borders, that would, where there's indigenous territories and other areas that are not as monitored then. For sure, drugs pass both ways. Guns are a massive problem coming from the south. So there's all kinds of problems. And we need to be careful because the American government, I'm now putting up a factoid from their own Homeland Security that shows less than 1% of fentanyl coming into Canada is coming into the States is coming in from Canada.
So what's his end goal then?
So, um, I'll tell you something. Everyone that works in this field is probably very confused because it's like some kid at school said, tapped this kid called Justin on the shoulder and said, "Hey, we're fighting. Meet me at, outside in the schoolyard." And everyone's just run out there, at noon, and then the instigators brought a gun to the fist fight, right?
Well, that's what it feels like. Yeah.
It does. And that's not normally how these fights are played out. So I have to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of confusion. And one thing that the Americans have always done when they needed to, and Canada does this too, but with America, their security concern is a vote getter, right? So it's always the security of the borders. So this is probably him trying to manufacture crises that he can solve. So there's no real crisis. Now he's made Justin, it sounds like Canada, the government's getting into the fentanyl business. We're going to have a fentanyl czar.
Yeah, saw that.
So maybe we're deciding to just get into the business. So again, it seems like he's won this concession. The extra spending on the border was already announced. Listen, the Americans have always wanted us to spend more on our border and the military. These are the longest standing complaints. So there's nothing new that Donald Trump is inheriting. There's no emergency, even like 9/11. But I think his emergency is his need to really show the American people that he's doing a great job, right?
Yeah.
And I think his willingness to go there is so shocking. It's almost more shocking to people that know something about it than the guy in the street.
Mhm.
Because, the guy in the street's like, well, whatever. He's trying to scare people. He's trying to win points, whatever. So now I've gotten all these emails of people that are in Ottawa reading the art of the deal because they're thinking he's not using the negotiation strategy we learned, like Harvard Business School, getting to yes, and what's your alternative to a negotiated agreement, all these things we learned.
Mhm.
People are now using the art of the deal, which is how to make money in real estate, to see if there's any clues as to how to respond to his opening move. So
I read that book a couple
so I'll throw it back to you guys. Is there something about how to negotiate in real estate that explains this better?
Well, I mean,
I think it was actually a pretty good book, to be honest.
like this is a tactic. I think it's like a negotiating tactic that you just show up at the table, act completely irrational and crazy, and it throws the other party off and they don't know how to react, right? So I get kind of the rationale of his irrational approach. I think what I'm surprised with is like, if you're going to do that, you'd expect they're fighting for something a little more than just the optics of more border security. You know what I mean?
Well,
Like,
he slips in other things, right? Then he complains that the US, remember he told Trudeau, we want US banks in here.
yeah,
But
okay.
again, we have to be careful that he's seizing on something. Oh, he's got us. No, these are ongoing issues. All
Yeah.
kinds of people can't go into other parts of the market, into protected industries. You can't even go to the States. How can you ban TikTok in the United States, right? If it's not some kind of because it's not owned by the Chinese government, but they're saying it's a
Security concern.
security concern, right? So everybody does this, and the
Mhm.
fact that he's spotted some great problem on the Canadian border. I mean, I'm very skeptical. And I think this is about his optics. Now, why he went so hard after Canada is the real confusion.
Yeah.
Um, that is a bit interesting because even to only put 10% tariffs on China, which is where fentanyl largely is manufactured and comes from around the world, is very interesting. So that's another part that I don't get. Why beat up on Canada? Even some conservatives were shocked as Doug Ford got caught hot mic going, I wanted that guy to win. And he
Shut
did
up,
this.
really?
He just
Yeah, I
got
saw
caught
it
on a
today.
mic.
That's
Yes,
hilarious.
yeah. And he's like, what the heck? I wanted this guy to win. So I think why that's the only thing that I really, unless, there's the other theory that they're doing a lot down there, right? Dismantling all kinds of things, their governments, they're shutting down entire departments,
Mhm.
cutting off veteran benefits. So is it some people are just saying distraction
Maybe. Yeah.
technique? Um,
I don't know. It's going to be interesting though. Like I think as Steve said, like as long as all of this uncertainty kind of cloud is kind of hovering over us, I think it's going to be a challenging year for housing, for the economy, for all of that stuff. And it's not just housing. I think like a lot of businesses are reluctant to invest when there's so much uncertainty. They
Mhm.
don't want to buy that next property for their business or expand, right?
Oh,
So I
no.
don't know. I think it's
No,
going to
the
be,
amount of business that is exposed because of our free trade,
yeah,
it's shocking. You're talking about private practices, even that buy supplies, everyday supplies over the borders. Like it's, so much of this can affect your bottom line.
yeah,
And now what this uncertainty has done is that even though he's called it off for 30 days, what do you do if you're a business? Do you spend the money to try to find alternate
mhm,
market? Like think of the business diversion this is causing,
true.
like just confusion, right?
Or is the caution tape going to still be up on all of the U.S. liquor goods in the LCBO for 30 days? I want to know.
Guys, don't drink Jack. If it comes to that, show some patriotism, okay?
100%, 100%.
Don't drink Jack.
I'm gonna pour my bourbon down the sink.
Don't do it.
Before we end, I want to take
Yeah,
it back to the real estate market. Steve, with all this uncertainty, the Bank of Canada did lower rates. So the policy rate now, I think it's down to
3%.
3%, right? So again, it's coming down. What do you think that does? With this backdrop against this larger backdrop of economic uncertainty, if anything.
Uh, I don't know. I mean, I think what John, from what I'm gathering from some of these lenders, is that close to 55% of new purchases are going variable.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, if you actually do get tariffs, it was BMO was out the other day saying, well, maybe you get 6 more cuts this year under these circumstances. Obviously, now the tariffs are paused. So what does that do to the rate outlook? Like nobody has any idea. Even the Bank of Canada is writing their monetary policy report saying we're cutting 25 basis points today, but we have no idea what the next 12 months looks like in terms of our policy rate. So again, I think if you do actually get into like a full on tariff war, obviously rates are moving lower. That's probably beneficial to the people that, I think we over the next 24 months, 60% of Canadian mortgages are coming up for renewal. So that's certainly beneficial for them. That's like your silver lining. Obviously, you got to hope that they keep a job because, it doesn't matter how low rates go. If you lose a job, I mean, you're not servicing your mortgage. So, I mean, that's probably all I would say is we'll see. I think that you would think rates should be modestly lower in the near future, but I just think like making a prediction and forecast today is almost like it's pointless.
Yeah, I agree. And I think all the economists are all over the map. No one can predict it because you're right. You're trying to predict the unpredictable. Like you're trying to predict what Trump's going to do next, and you can't fucking predict that, right?
Yeah,
It's just
yeah,
it's
yeah.
not possible.
So
His
honestly,
news, yeah.
I feel like the only thing I have conviction on, and I'm curious your thoughts. The only thing I have conviction on is like, regardless of what Trump does with tariffs or not with tariffs, only thing I know for sure is that the investor market is going to still suck this year. People that bought pre-sales are still going to be in really tough, and the rental market's still going to be soft. Like that over the next 12 months, I think is kind of baked into the cake. You know, uh,
Even if we see 6 cuts to the Bank of Canada,
I think the investor market still sucks because
I
I
think
think
it's
people are going to be
yeah,
so. I think people under the circumstances where you're cutting 6 times, it's like holy crap, this is a
it
pretty bad recession. And
exactly. I agree.
as an investor, I'm like, I don't know what I need to do here, but I need to like stay liquid, get through the storm.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think those are probably the key certainties with housing for this year, for sure.
All
Yeah, like
right.
28-year low in pre-sales last year. I mean,
Yeah,
can it get worse this year? I mean, I honestly maybe.
yeah.
Who's buying a pre-sale this year?
Good luck. Yeah, 100%.
Guys, where's
All
your
right.
optimism? Where's your the art of the deal, the winning?
Yeah.
We got to be more optimistic here. Bring that fighting real estate spirit. Should we all go read the art of the deal? Do you think, Steve? Will this
I
give
thought
us
it was
some
a good. I
insight
thought it
into
was a
what's going to happen?
I actually thought it was a good book. Like in general, I thought it was interesting. Like his story. Again, people might not like him. That's totally fine. But
Mhm.
I think his story is still interesting. I mean,
Is it a biography, basically? Is it more of a biography?
yeah, he talks a lot about the deals that he did and how he got certain buildings and projects developed. And I think, I mean, let's call it what it is. I mean, he's a vulture. I mean, like when the market is in tight and there's deals to be had, like he's out there and he'll run you into the ground. Like I mean, how do you become a billionaire? I mean, you got to be cutthroat, and I think his book basically highlights all the stories about how he kind of built up this real estate empire. So it's interesting.
So John, now
Mhm.
doesn't his negotiating style make more sense?
100%.
I also do wonder, jokes aside, if we should read it because he's not just his biggest art is marketing.
Mhm.
He is a marketer,
He is,
uh,
yeah.
more than anything. And so it's interesting, like his words that they're the biggest and his actions are the biggest, but maybe he picks Canada because picking a much bigger fight with China right now would be a scarier first move, right?
Mhm.
So it's very interesting. So maybe we all need to read that and regroup next month.
Yeah,
You can read it
homework
for
for
me.
everybody listening.
I
All right.
I'm happy to go on the record and say I do not like his
Yeah,
character.
you can read that and then you can negotiate your next pre-sale.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, act
Exactly.
like a lunatic.
Yeah.
Absolutely dumb. Okay, very good. So next month, guys, the art of the deal, according to Pasalis and Saretsky,
We'll see how it
join
goes.
us, and
Beautiful.
we'll resume. Thank you both so much, and yeah, thank you to our viewers and listeners. I'm sure you have a lot of opinions about all the different views, so leave them on our YouTube channel. You can also comment on X Twitter at John Pasalis. Steve is at Steve Saretsky, and the show is at Move Smartly. Thank you, everyone.